It's 4:47 in the morning, May 11th, 1945, Luzon, Philippines, and a young man named John McKini is lying in his tent, completely unaware that over 100 Japanese soldiers are silently moving through the jungle, heading straight for him. Now, before we get into what happens next, and trust me, what happens next is something that military historians still struggle to explain. I want you to understand who this man actually was, because that context matters. John McKini wasn't some highly trained Special Forces operative. He wasn't an officer with years of strategic education. He was 24 years old, the son of a sharecropper from Screven County, Georgia. And he had a third-grade education. He grew up with almost nothing. And that upbringing, that life of genuine scarcity and survival, is actually central to understanding everything that's about to happen. There's something important here that often gets overlooked when we talk about war heroes. We tend to frame courage as this dramatic, almost cinematic thing. But in reality, a lot of what makes someone capable of surviving an impossible situation comes from the quiet, unglamorous skills they built long before any war began. McKini had spent his entire childhood in the Georgia woods. His father farmed land they didn't own. When crops failed, the family didn't eat unless John brought something home. He learned to shoot before he could read. By the time he was 12, he could hit a squirrel at 50 yards with a .22 rifle. He trapped rabbits. He hunted deer. He learned to move through dense terrain quietly, patiently, and with an acute awareness of everything around him. That wasn't a hobby. That was survival. So when he enlisted at Fort McPherson in November 1942, and the Army ran him through their qualification tests, they discovered something interesting. The man could barely read or write, but his marksmanship scores were exceptional. Drill sergeants noticed he moved differently in the field, more deliberate, more attuned. He wasn't performing the skills, he'd internalized them years before the Army ever got involved. And here's a broader lesson worth sitting with for a moment. The skills that save your life, in whatever field you're in, are rarely the ones you develop under pressure. They're the ones you build consistently over years, often without knowing exactly why you're building them. McKini didn't train in the Georgia woods so he could fight a war. He did it because he had to eat. But when the moment came, those skills were there. The 33rd Infantry Division shipped to the Pacific in 1943. McKini fought through New Guinea. He survived jungle warfare, disease, the brutal physical and psychological toll of the Pacific theater. By May 1945, he was a veteran, quiet, dependable, never complained. His fellow soldiers knew two things about him. He was the best shot in the company, and he slept with his rifle next to him. That rifle is about to become extremely relevant. Now, back to the night of May 11th. By this point in the Philippine campaign, the United States had already suffered over 60,000 casualties. Japanese forces on Luzon were not surrendering. They were launching night raids, dawn attacks, desperate charges against American positions. Company A of the 123rd Infantry Regiment had set up an outpost near Dingalan Bay in Tayabas Province. This outpost guarded a critical supply route. It wasn't glamorous work. It was the kind of grinding, logistical duty that makes up most of what soldiers actually do in a war. 3 Americans were manning a light machine gun on the perimeter. McKini had just finished a long shift at that gun. He walked a few paces to his tent, laid down, and closed his eyes. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the Japanese had been watching this outpost for days. Counting the Americans, timing the guard rotations, mapping the layout. The attack force was over 100 soldiers. Remnants of Japanese units still fighting in the hills. They carried rifles, grenades, knee mortars, and swords. Their objective was straightforward and brutal. Overrun the position. Kill everyone. Take the supplies. The advance element slipped past the outer guard post in complete silence. Sergeant Fukutaro Mori was leading the vanguard. His orders were to eliminate the first Americans, quietly, no gunfire. Swords and bayonets only. The idea was to compromise the perimeter before the main force even announced itself. Mori reached McKini's tent. He could hear the American breathing inside. He pulled back the tent flap. His sword came down in a diagonal slash, aimed at McKini's neck. In the darkness, he misjudged the distance. The blade caught McKini on the side of the head instead. It severed part of his right ear. McKini's eyes opened to blinding pain, and the silhouette of a man standing over him, raising a sword for a second strike. He had less than 1 second. His hand found his rifle. He didn't aim. He didn't think. 24 years of instinct took over. Burut. He swung the M1 like a club. The rifle butt caught Mori under the chin with enough force to shatter bone. Mori staggered. McKini swung again. The second blow ended the fight. Blood was pouring from his ear. His head was ringing. And outside the tent, he could hear footsteps, dozens of them, moving fast through the camp. The main assault had begun. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out into the darkness. The machine gun position was 30 yards away. The 3 men who'd been manning it when he went to sleep were now in the middle of a firefight. At muzzle flashes, screaming. The crack of Japanese Arasaka rifles mixing with the deeper reports of M1 Garands. The first wave of Japanese soldiers had already hit the gun emplacement. McKini could see figures struggling in the darkness around the sandbag wall. His mind processed the tactical situation in seconds. That machine gun was the anchor of the entire defensive line. It covered the main approach into the camp. If the Japanese captured it and turned it around, they could pour fire into the entire perimeter. Every man in Company A would be exposed. He ran toward the gun. The 2 soldiers who'd replaced him at the machine gun were fighting for their lives. One of them, Private James Hendricks, had taken a bayonet wound to the shoulder in the opening seconds. The other soldier made a difficult but arguably correct decision. He grabbed his wounded comrade and dragged him toward the rear of the perimeter. Hendricks would have bled out if he'd been left there. But that decision meant the machine gun was now completely undefended. 10 Japanese soldiers reached the emplacement before McKini could get there. They swarmed over the sandbag wall. One of them immediately began trying to turn the gun around. McKini didn't slow down. He didn't take cover. He didn't wait for backup. He sprinted directly at 10 enemy soldiers who had just captured the most critical weapon in the outpost. The Japanese saw him coming. A single American, bleeding from a head wound, charging straight at them. 2 of them raised their rifles. I miss him. McKini was faster. He shot the first man at 15 yards, the second at 10. By the time he reached the sandbag wall, he'd fired 4 rounds and 4 Japanese soldiers were down. He leaped into the emplacement. The space inside was roughly 8 by 6 feet. 6 enemy soldiers were still alive in there. Some were swinging their rifles around. Others reached for bayonets. One was still fumbling with the machine gun's traversing mechanism. McKini landed among them and kept firing. Point-blank range. The M1 Garand holds 8 rounds. He'd already fired 4. He put the next 3 into 3 more soldiers at distances measured in inches. 1 round left. The 8th man was directly in front of him, bayonet raised. McKini fired his last round. The soldier dropped. The M1's bolt locked back on an empty magazine with that distinctive metallic ping, a sound every soldier in World War II recognized. 3 Japanese soldiers were still alive in the gun pit. They'd heard that sound. They knew exactly what it meant. McKini reversed his grip on the rifle before the empty clip had finished ejecting and started swinging. 10 Japanese soldiers had captured the machine gun. 30 seconds later, all 10 were dead. But McKini's situation hadn't improved. It had gotten more complicated. He grabbed for the machine gun. His hands found the receiver, and immediately he knew something was wrong. During the struggle inside the emplacement, the weapon had been damaged. The bolt was jammed. The feed tray was bent. He cycled the charging handle twice. Nothing. The most important weapon in the entire outpost was now useless. He looked up from the broken gun, and in the gray pre-dawn light spreading across the eastern sky, he saw them. More Japanese soldiers. Many more. They were regrouping at the edge of the jungle, preparing for the next wave. Let's pause here for a second, because I think this moment is worth examining. McKini had just done something extraordinary. He'd cleared 10 armed men from a fortified position, alone, in under a minute. Most people, in that situation, would feel one of two things, either paralyzed by what they'd just been through, or dangerously overconfident. McKini felt neither. What he did instead was assess. He looked at the broken machine gun. He looked at his empty rifle. He looked at the jungle. And then he started solving the next problem. That's a pattern that shows up consistently in accounts of people who perform under extreme pressure, not the absence of fear, but the ability to redirect attention away from the emotional reality of the moment and toward the next actionable decision. McKini reached down and pulled a bandolier of ammunition from one of the dead Japanese soldiers. American. 30 caliber rounds. The man had probably taken them from a previous engagement. He loaded a fresh clip into his rifle. Somewhere in the darkness, a Japanese officer was shouting orders. McKini couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. They were coming again. He settled into the gun pit among the bodies, rested his rifle on the sandbag wall, and waited. The second wave emerged from the jungle 60 yards out, at least 20 soldiers in the first line. More behind them. They came at a full run, rifles with fixed bayonets, screaming as they charged. Now, here's where McKini's background becomes critical again. And this is something I find genuinely fascinating from an educational standpoint. The Army had trained McKini, yes. But what he was doing in the next few minutes wasn't really Army training. It was hunting. The M1 Garand was designed for rapid semi-automatic fire. A trained soldier could put 8 aimed rounds downrange in under 10 seconds. McKini was faster, because a trained soldier is working from muscle memory built over months of drills. McKini was working from muscle memory built over a decade of actual fieldwork. Lead the target. Squeeze, don't pull. Acquire the next. The first soldier dropped at 60 yards. He shifted. The second fell. Then the third. Brass casings ejected to his right. He wasn't thinking about it. His body remembered thousands of mornings in the Georgia woods. The clip ejected with a ping. He slammed in a fresh one. The charging wave had covered 20 yards during his reload. He started firing again. The Japanese soldiers in that second wave had expected to find a captured machine gun position, their comrades already turning the gun on, the sleeping Americans. Instead, they found one man with a rifle, cutting them down with mechanical precision. 8 rounds, reload, 8 rounds, reload. Some of the attackers made it to within 15 yards before McKini dropped them. Others tried to veer left or right, seeking cover. He tracked them. And here's something he said later that stuck with me. A soldier who moves is easier to hit than a soldier who stands still. He'd learned that hunting deer. The second wave broke. The survivors scattered back toward the jungle. McKini quickly counted the bodies in front of his position. 11 more. 21 total, since the attack had begun less than 20 minutes ago. He didn't have time to process that number. Japanese officers were already reorganizing beyond the tree line. And then he heard something new. A hollow thump from somewhere in the jungle. Then another. Knee mortars. The first round exploded 10 yards to his left. Dirt and shrapnel sprayed across the gun pit. The second hit closer. The third landed directly on the parapet. The Japanese had adapted. They weren't going to charge blindly into his rifle fire again. They'd soften the position first, suppress him, or kill him outright, then send in the infantry. McKini understood the tactical problem immediately. If he stayed in the gun pit, the mortar crews would eventually find their range. They were adjusting with each shot, walking the rounds in. But if he moved, he'd lose the only fortified position in this section of the perimeter. Then a grenade landed 3 feet away from him. McKini grabbed it and threw it back over the sandbags. It detonated in midair. The blast wave knocked him sideways. His ears were ringing. Blood from his severed ear had soaked through the makeshift bandage he'd pressed against the wound. Another mortar round hit the sandbags directly. The wall partially collapsed. He was now half exposed to the jungle. He made his decision. He grabbed 2 bandoliers of ammunition from the dead soldiers around him, slung them over his shoulder, and ran. The Japanese saw him moving. Rifle fire cracked from the tree line. Bullets snapped past his head. He sprinted 15 yards to a shallow depression in the ground, not a proper foxhole, just a slight dip in the terrain. He threw himself into it, rolled onto his back, crawled to the edge, found a firing position. The Japanese infantry was moving again. They thought he was retreating. 2 squads emerged from the jungle at a fast walk, moving toward the abandoned gun pit. McKini let them get to 30 yards. Then he opened fire. The attackers had bunched together while crossing the open ground. A mistake. His first shot dropped the point man. His second hit the soldier directly behind. The group scattered, but there was no cover between the jungle and McKini's new position. He picked them off as they ran. The survivors reached the gun pit and found only bodies their comrades from the first wave. They'd expected to find the American there. Instead, they found him shooting at them from a completely different angle. He changed position again, 10 yards to his right, found another depression, started firing from the new location. And this is the thing that's easy to miss when you're reading about this battle. What McKini was doing wasn't just bravery. It was strategy. He was applying a principle that hunters have understood for centuries. Never stay in one place. Never let your target predict where the next shot is coming from. A deer that hears one gunshot will freeze. A deer that hears 2 from different locations will run in circles. The Japanese were running in circles. Dawn light was spreading across the sky. McKini had been fighting for 18 minutes. His ammunition was running low. His ear was still bleeding. And he could see movement in the jungle, suggesting the enemy was massing for another major push. He needed more ammunition, and he knew exactly where to find it. The dead Japanese soldiers around the gun pit. Some were carrying American. 30 caliber rounds scavenged from previous engagements. Others had grenades clipped to their belts. He needed to get back there. He waited for a lull in the mortar fire, counted to 3, then sprinted across the open ground. Rifle fire erupted from the tree line the moment he moved. A bullet tugged at his sleeve. Another cracked past his ear. He dove the last 5 feet and landed among the bodies he'd created 20 minutes earlier. The smell hit him immediately blood. Cordite, the sharp copper of death. McKini ignored it. He'd gutted deer in the Georgia heat. He'd butchered hogs on the farm. The smell of death was not unfamiliar. He moved quickly through the bodies, grabbed every bandolier he could find, every loose clip. He found 4 American ammunition pouches on men who had probably taken them as trophies, 64 more rounds. He stuffed them into his pockets and belt. Then a Japanese soldier appeared over the sandbag wall. Must have crawled forward while McKini was resupplying. The man's rifle was already coming up. McKini shot him through the chest at 2 feet. He grabbed the dead man's grenades, 3 of them. Japanese Type 97 fragmentation grenades. He'd never used one before, but he'd seen them. Pull the pin. Strike the cap against something hard. Count to 4. Throw. Movement in his peripheral vision. More soldiers approaching from the left. He armed a grenade, counted, and threw it over the sandbags. The explosion was followed by screaming. He armed the second grenade, threw it toward where he'd seen muzzle flashes concentrated in the tree line. More screaming. He was out of the gun pit before the third grenade left his hand. Running again. Keep moving. The sky was light enough now to see clearly. 23 minutes into the attack, McKini had killed or wounded at least 30 enemy soldiers, but he knew the math wasn't in his favor. The Japanese had started with roughly 100 men. Even if half were down, that still left 50, and he was still completely alone. Where was the rest of Company A? The answer was that the Japanese attack had hit multiple points along the perimeter simultaneously. Other soldiers were fighting their own battles on the south and west sides of the camp. The company commander was trying to organize a coherent defense. But in the darkness and chaos of a coordinated night attack, that kind of coordination was nearly impossible. McKini didn't know any of that. He only knew that no one had come to help him. No reinforcements, no supporting fire, just him, his rifle, and the ground in front of him. From a foxhole he'd found abandoned near the northern edge of the perimeter, he could see the Japanese officers regrouping at the tree line. studying the perimeter through binoculars. And then he saw one of them gesture not toward the gun pit, not toward the craters where McKini had been fighting, toward the supply tents. A flanking maneuver, a completely different axis of attack, designed to bypass the killing ground McKini had created. He read the enemy's intention instantly. If they got through to the supply tents, they'd be inside the American perimeter with clear shots at soldiers fighting on other sections of the line. He had a choice: stay in the foxhole where he had cover and clear fields of fire, or move to intercept an attack he might not reach in time. McKini climbed out of the foxhole and started running toward the supply tents. He covered 40 yards in 8 seconds and threw himself behind a stack of ammunition crates just as the first Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle on the southern approach. They hadn't expected him to be there. The lead element 12 soldiers in a tactical column was heading for the gap between 2 tents. McKini opened fire from the shadows, and the first 3 men went down before the others could react. The 4th and 5th tried to return fire but couldn't locate him. He shot them both. The remaining 7 scattered some back toward the jungle, others diving for cover behind fallen logs and shallow depressions. McKini tracked the ones who went to ground and pinned them. Then he shifted his aim to the tree line, where more soldiers were emerging. The Japanese commander had committed his reserve force to this flanking attack 20, maybe 25 men. They saw their comrades pinned down and hesitated at the edge of the jungle. That hesitation cost them 8 rounds. Reload. 8 rounds. Bodies dropped among the trees. The survivors pulled back into deeper cover. 26 minutes into the attack, the Japanese had tried 3 different approaches: frontal assault on the machine gun, mortar bombardment, followed by infantry, flanking maneuver toward the supply area. All 3 had failed. And now the commander faced a problem his doctrine hadn't prepared him for. His soldiers were reporting heavy fire from multiple positions. Across the perimeter, muzzle flashes from the gun pit, then a depression 30 yards away, then from behind the supply crates. It looked like interlocking fields of fire from several riflemen supporting each other. That assessment was wrong. It was one man, moving fast, shooting accurately, and never staying in the same place twice. 31 minutes into the battle, the Japanese had figured it out. Not the full picture. They still didn't know it was one man, but they'd learned enough to change their approach. The waves had stopped. Instead, individual soldiers began advancing in rotation, one man moving while others provided covering fire. Then another leapfrogging forward, closing the distance yard by yard. It was a textbook tactic designed specifically to overwhelm a single defender. Even the best marksman in the world can only track so many targets moving at different times from different directions. Eventually, someone gets close enough. McKini recognized what they were doing immediately. He'd seen it before, not in any military manual, but in the Georgia woods. A pack of coyotes approaching prey doesn't bunch together and charge. They spread out. They approach from multiple angles. They force their target to divide its attention. The prey can only watch one threat at a time. The others close in. He was the prey now, and he knew it. On the southern approach, Japanese soldiers had closed to within 20 yards. On the northeast, 15 yards. McKini had fewer than 30 rounds remaining. The foxhole that had protected him for the last several minutes was about to become his grave. So he did something that, on the surface, sounds insane.
Move out now.
He burst out of the foxhole and charged directly at the nearest group of Japanese soldiers. 5 men were crouched behind a fallen palm tree 15 yards to the northeast, waiting for their comrades to close from the other side. They did not expect their target to attack. McKini shot the first man while still running, shot the second as he reached the log. The third rose to meet him with a bayonet thrust. McKini sidestepped and drove his rifle butt into the man's face. The fourth swung his rifle like a club. McKini ducked under the swing and drove the steel butt plate of his M1 into the soldier's throat. The fifth tried to run. McKini shot him at 3 yards. He kept moving. He couldn't stop. Stopping meant death. The southern group had seen him leave the foxhole. They were already sprinting toward his position. McKini turned and fired. 2 men dropped. The others kept coming. He fired again. Another fell. Then the M1 pinged empty. 3 Japanese soldiers reached him before he could reload. The first tackled him around the waist. McKini went down hard. His rifle flew from his hands. The second soldier stomped on his wounded ear. The pain that exploded through his skull at that moment, with a partially severed ear that had been bleeding for over half an hour, is something most of us genuinely cannot imagine. The third raised a bayonet for a killing thrust. McKini grabbed the ankle of the man standing on his head and twisted. The soldier lost his balance and fell. McKini rolled, throwing off the man who'd tackled him. The bayonet thrust missed his chest by inches and buried itself in the dirt. He scrambled to his knees, found his rifle, and swung it in a wide arc that caught one soldier across the temple. Sina. The man collapsed. He reversed the swing and drove the butt plate into another soldier's ribs. Bones broke under the impact. Dead. The third soldier had pulled his bayonet from the ground and lunged. McKini blocked the thrust with his rifle barrel, stepped inside the man's reach, and headbutted him. Then hit him twice more with the rifle butt. He stopped moving. 33 minutes since the attack began. McKini stood in the gray morning light, breathing hard, hands slick with blood, some of it his own, most of it not. His ear was a mass of torn flesh and dried gore. His uniform was ripped in a dozen places. He had bruises and cuts he didn't remember receiving, but he was still standing. He looked around the battlefield, bodies everywhere. Japanese soldiers who had come to kill Americans and found something they hadn't planned for. Etiti, and then movement to his right. 2 more soldiers emerging from the jungle. McKini raised his rifle and realized it was empty. He hadn't reloaded after the hand-to-hand fighting. The 2 soldiers saw him standing among the bodies of their comrades. They hesitated. That hesitation. Again. McKini charged. He covered 10 yards before they could react. The first soldier tried to bring his rifle up. Too slow. McKini's rifle butt caught him under the chin. The second turned to run. McKini chased him down in 3 strides and clubbed him from behind. 34 minutes. He remembered the mortar position. Throughout the battle, knee mortars had been hammering his positions from the southwest. Taking out those crews would eliminate the indirect fire threat entirely. He found a loaded M1 among the dead, dropped his damaged weapon, and started moving toward the mortar position. The mortar crews saw him coming. 2 men, adjusting their weapon for another fire mission. They scrambled to defend themselves. One reached for a rifle. The other tried to arm a grenade. McKini shot them both from 45 yards. 35 minutes. He stood in the morning light and scanned the jungle for more targets. His chest heaved. His vision was blurring from exhaustion and blood loss. Every muscle in his body was screaming. The jungle was quiet. No more soldiers emerging from the trees. No more mortar rounds. No more rifle fire from concealed positions. Just the moans of wounded men and the sound of flies already gathering on the dead. McKini walked back toward the American perimeter. He was halfway there when he saw figures moving toward him, American uniforms. Soldiers from Company A who had finally fought through to his section of the line. They stopped when they saw him, covered in blood, carrying a rifle that wasn't his. Surrounded by bodies in every direction, McKini lowered his weapon. 36 minutes after Sergeant Fukutaro Mori had slashed open his tent with a sword. Private John McKini was still standing, still breathing, and in complete control of the area. The battle was over, but no one yet understood what had actually happened. The soldiers who reached McKini that morning were from 2nd Platoon. They'd been fighting on the western edge of the perimeter when the attack hit, and had taken 36 minutes to push through to his position. What they found defied comprehension. Bodies lay scattered across an area roughly 100 yards long and 60 yards wide. Japanese soldiers slumped over sandbags, crumpled in shell craters, sprawled among the supply crates, piled on top of each other near the damaged machine gun emplacement. The platoon sergeant ordered a count. His men moved through the battlefield, checking bodies, marking positions. The count took 20 minutes. When they finished, the sergeant didn't believe the number. He ordered them to count again. 38 dead Japanese soldiers in the immediate vicinity of the machine gun position. 2 more bodies near the mortar emplacement, 45 yards away. 40 confirmed kills. 1 man, 36 minutes. The sergeant found McKini sitting on an ammunition crate, pressing a blood-soaked bandage against what remained of his right ear. His rifle stock was cracked from repeated impacts against human skulls. He looked, by every account, like a man who had walked through the worst thing imaginable and come out the other side. The sergeant asked what had happened. McKini gave a brief account. The tent, the sword, the machine gun, the waves of attackers. Short sentences. No embellishment. Just facts. The sergeant didn't believe him. No single soldier could kill 40 men in 36 minutes. It was impossible. There had to have been other defenders, other riflemen supporting his position. The private must be confused from blood loss and combat stress. But then they looked at the rest of Company A. The 2 men who'd originally manned the machine gun with McKini had evacuated to the rear with wounds. Everyone else had been fighting on different sections of the perimeter. The ballistic evidence supported McKini's account exactly. Spent M1 casings littered the ground at precisely the positions he'd described. The trajectory of wounds on the Japanese bodies matched the firing angles from those same positions. The 33rd Infantry Division sent an intelligence team to verify the report. They interviewed McKini, interviewed every available witness, examined the battlefield, and counted the bodies again. Some accounts suggested the actual number of Japanese dead in the broader engagement exceeded 100, but only 40 could be directly attributed to McKini's actions with certainty. The investigators reached an unavoidable conclusion. The report was accurate. 1 man had single-handedly repelled an attack by approximately 100 Japanese soldiers, killed 40 of them, and prevented what would almost certainly have been the annihilation of his entire company. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor went forward in June 1945. Now, a quick note on what that actually means, because I think it's worth understanding the weight of it. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration the United States government can award. Fewer than 3 chawam. 500 have been given since the Civil War. Sanam. The criteria are specific and deliberately difficult to meet. The recipient must have distinguished themselves conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of their own life, above and beyond the call of duty. McKini's actions didn't just meet those criteria. They exceeded them by almost any measure you could apply. On January 23, 1946, Private John McKini stood in the White House. President Harry Truman placed a Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation described what he'd done in formal military language: extreme gallantry, unsurpassed intrepidity, single-handedly thwarting an assault that threatened to annihilate his company. The press called him the Pacific's Audie Murphy. Murphy had received his Medal of Honor for single-handedly holding off German forces in France. Another case of 1 man against overwhelming odds, refusing to retreat, somehow surviving. Both men had faced situations where every rational calculation said they should have died. Both had refused to accept that calculation. But while Murphy came home and became a movie star, McKini went home to Georgia. He was 25 years old. He had a Medal of Honor, a 3rd-grade education, and a partially severed ear that would never fully heal. The war was over. The killing was done. And John McKini had to figure out how to be a normal person again. He went back to the only life he knew: farming, hunting, fishing, in the same creeks where he'd learned to shoot as a boy. Neighbors knew he'd received the Medal of Honor. They'd seen the newspaper articles. But McKini never brought it up, never displayed the medal, never attended reunions or sought out interviews. When people asked about Luzon, he'd say a few words and change the subject. The nightmares were a different matter. His family knew about those. The sounds he made in his sleep, the way he'd wake suddenly, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. What we now recognize as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, wasn't a recognized diagnosis in 1946. Soldiers who struggled with what they'd seen and done were told, essentially, to get over it. Move on. Be grateful you survived. McKini did what most veterans of his generation did. He buried it and kept working. He married, raised a family, worked various jobs around Screven County. Korea came and went. Vietnam came and went. New wars, new heroes, new veterans with their own buried memories. McKini remained in Georgia, quietly living, quietly aging. The Medal of Honor sat in a drawer somewhere. And I think that detail, the medal in a drawer, says something important, something worth thinking about. We live in a culture that celebrates recognition, that treats visibility as validation. But John McKini, who had arguably done one of the most extraordinary things any single soldier had ever done in the Pacific Theater, wanted none of it. He didn't define himself by the 36 minutes on Luzon. He defined himself by the life he lived before it and the life he built after it. There's a lesson in that. Not that recognition is wrong, or that people shouldn't be honored for what they've done, but that the value of what you do isn't determined by how many people know about it. In 1965, an author named Forrest Bryant Johnson began researching McKini's story. Johnson was a veteran himself. He understood what McKini had experienced in a way that most civilians couldn't. He spent years tracking down witnesses, examining military records, piecing together the details of those 36 minutes. It was difficult work. McKini didn't want to talk. Many of the witnesses had died. Military records were scattered across multiple archives. But Johnson persisted, because he believed the story deserved to be told. His book, Phantom Warrior, was published in 2007. It documented McKini's childhood in Georgia, his service in the Pacific, and the battle that earned him the Medal of Honor. The book brought renewed attention to a hero most Americans had never heard of. McKini didn't live to see it published. He died on April 5th, 1997 in Sylvania, Georgia. He was 76 years old. The sharecropper's son, who had stopped a 100-man assault with a rifle, and his bare hands passed away quietly, surrounded by family, and was buried in Screven County, not far from the land where he had learned to hunt as a boy. 20 years after his death, Georgia honored him again. In 2017, the state legislature voted to rename a section of highway in Screven County. It became the John R. McKini Medal of Honor Highway. Drivers pass that sign today without knowing the story behind the name. They don't know about the tent and the sword. They don't know about the broken machine gun and the 36 minutes. They don't know that the quiet farmer who once lived nearby had saved an entire company of men through an act of courage that military. Historians still struggle to fully explain. 40 men in 36 minutes. One rifle, one soldier. One morning in the Philippines that should have ended in massacre and ended in something else entirely. Private John McKini never asked to be a hero. He was a farm boy who joined the army because there was a war. He did what he had to do to survive and to protect the men sleeping around him. And then he went home and lived a quiet life and never talked about it. That's the story. That's the legacy. And I think the reason it matters, the reason it's worth telling and worth hearing, isn't just because the numbers are staggering. It's because of what this man was before any of that happened. A kid from a poor farming family, barely literate, who spent his childhood building skills out of necessity, who showed up to one of the worst moments imaginable and drew on everything those years had given him. If this story hit you the way it hit us when we first came across it in the archives, do us a favor and hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube this story is worth sharing, and stories like this one deserve to be seen. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are pulling forgotten histories out of dusty records every single day. Real people, real moments. The kind of stories that don't make the history textbooks, but absolutely should. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, anywhere in the world. Our community stretches across every continent, and you are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us where you are. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Because John McKini spent 50 years with his medal in a drawer, never asking to be remembered. The least we can do is remember him now.